Harlan Wheatley, Master Distiller here at Buffalo Trace Distillery, and we've been distilling here for over 200 years. The reason we call it Buffalo Trace is because the buffalo crossed the Kentucky River here at the site in the original settlement, and the pioneers followed behind it. So we call it Buffalo Trace in honor of that original heritage. We use Yellow Dent #1 grade corn for our Buffalo Trace in order to deliver some sweetness to the base bourbon whiskey. And then we add a small amount of rye, and what that does, it adds spice and fruitiness from the rye grain. And then we add the malted barley, which is used primarily for the enzyme, but it does contribute somewhat to the flavor. We grind everything through a hammer mill, and once we grind that all out, we put it in meal bins. On the meal floor, we'll use a traveling scale hopper, and that traveling scale hopper allows us to move from one meal bin to the other. And then we'll pull out the rye and the malted barley in separate hoppers, and we cook those separately in smaller tubs. One of the things that we do a little different than others is we pressure cook all of our corn. And when you're cooking rye, we cook to 160 degrees. The malt is the same way, we go at about 155. And so you get complete conversion with the rye. And then when we add the pressure, it just allows us to cook a little bit faster and more complete. Once we complete the cooks, you put those under pressure, cool them down with a vacuum system, and then we'll pump those cooks, each one, into a fermenter. And we have 12 large fermenters, or 92,000 gallons, and we're putting in about 88,000 gallons in each fermenter. Before we add all the grains, we add yeast. And once we put the yeast in, then the yeast starts consuming the sugars that were converted during cooking. As we add those cooks, the yeast becomes more hungry when you hydrate it, and when you add those cooks, the yeast starts consuming the sugar. The byproduct of that action is the alcohol. After they're fermented, we'll pump that beer to the beer still. And we have a 7-foot diameter, 30-foot tall still that we use for distilling all the first distillation for our Buffalo Trace. And then we will double distill into a pot, and we'll do that again so all of our whiskey is double distilled. And then we'll send that to the warehouse where we'll put that whiskey into the barrel. The barrels are a very important part of the process for Buffalo Trace bourbon. We have to use new charred oak. We specify that we want to age our wood at least 6 months before we char that wood, and we have the tightest specs in the business. As Buffalo Trace ages in the barrel, it's picking up color every year. So it evaporates about 3%, but it also picks up color from the wood. It's all those wood sugars and caramels and tannins that you pick up from the wood. So it's important when you're picking locations in the warehouse to consider temperature and climate. So we tend to pick middle floors or sweet spots for Buffalo Trace based on climate. And then the colder weather extracts that whiskey out of the wood. So you're getting, throughout the even days, you're going to get a variation of the breathing of the barrel of the whiskey going in and out of the wood. And that's a good thing because it's extracting those good flavors from the wood. Once the Buffalo Trace is aged and reached maturity, we go into the warehouses and we sample each of those barrels and we taste them, and we still compare those samples to the very first batch we made in 1999. We want consistent flavor. We want that to be a nice, mature, well-rounded bourbon to give all the aspects we're after, the sweetness and the caramel flavors and vanilla. And once they reach the peak of maturity and we think they taste just right, we'll put those barrels into a batch and we bottle them as Buffalo Trace.